Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As Presiding Officer, I am delighted to welcome you to the Scottish Parliament and to this, the 2014 Edinburgh International Culture Summit. This summit is a collaboration between the Scottish Parliament, the British Council, Edinburgh International Festival, the Scottish Government and the UK Government. This is the second cultural summit following on from the great success of the summit in 2012. It is an opportunity to bring you together in the midst of Edinburgh's renowned festivals. And so soon after, Glasgow played host to the Commonwealth Games, during which we saw great sporting and cultural events which also brought people together from across the world. The Scottish Parliament is, as I'm sure if you've managed to have a tour at all, it is a cultural icon and a work of art in its own right. And I hope you agree with me that it is a fitting venue for ministers and guests from around the world to gather to explore the unique role that arts and culture play as a form of exchange to build trust between cultures and nations. Culture is what defines us as a nation and as individuals within those nations. It is at the very heart of who we are and what we do. It is the potential to make a huge economic impact and to be a force for positive change. The Scottish Parliament plays an important role in promoting and supporting culture, both through our parliamentary process and its engagement programme. If you haven't already done so, I hope you get the chance to look at the great tapestry of Scotland that is featured in the main hall. This unique tapestry, the longest of its kind in the whole of the world, depicts Scotland's history from the very beginning, from prehistory right up until the present day. And this year's summit will no doubt build on the strong foundation set during the first Culture Summit in 2012, during which representatives from 33 countries came together. Summit 2014 will allow further debate and idea sharing. The next couple of days will let government and cultural leaders discuss how arts and culture are best sustained, promoted and protected, and will generate new opportunities for cultural exchanges and collaborations. Culture is a powerful entity. It is what has brought us all here today, and hopefully it will continue to do so, and to bring more people and nations together in the future. The overarching theme of this year's summit is culture, a currency of trust. Over the next couple of days, we will reflect how arts and culture can create a mutual understanding between nations, states and cities. To achieve this, we will focus on three interlinked policy strands. Firstly, values and measurements, cities and culture, and advocacy and identity. So it is clear that we have plenty of discussions to come, and I do hope that you will both enjoy the presentations that will be made, that you will take part and to exchange your own ideas. So, once again, welcome to the Scottish Parliament. I hope we have a really productive time here, but perhaps more importantly, I hope you enjoy yourself here, notwithstanding the appalling weather we have. If I could have done better, I would. But I'm sure that the discussions in here will not be dry. I think they will be extremely warm. And I hope that as you enter into it, you will recognise how important it is that you are here and how much we value you coming to take part in this Culture Festival. And can I now invite the Cabinet Secretary for Culture and External Affairs, Fiona Hislop MSP, to welcome you all to Summit 2014 on behalf of the Scottish Government.
Presiding Officer, fellow Culture Ministers, Delegates, ladies and gentlemen, may I extend the warmest of welcomes from the Government and people of Scotland to the Edinburgh International Culture Summit 2014. My thanks to the presiding officer for her remarks and all that she and her colleagues in the Scottish Parliament have contributed to this summit, not least through providing such a splendid venue. She isn't responsible for the weather. If Scotland didn't have so much rain and water, our country would not be so beautiful and green, and our whisky might not taste the same. My thanks also goes to our other partners in this event, the Right Honourable Sajid David, Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, who we will hear from shortly, Sir Jonathan Mills of the Edinburgh International Festival, and Sir Martin Davidson of the British Council. My thanks above all to all of you for coming in such numbers and often so far to this summit. As the Chinese philosopher Confucius said in the opening words of his Analects, "Is it not delightful to have friends coming from distant quarters?" So I am delighted to see so many friends, those with whom I have already forged a friendship and those I hope to make over the next few days, from as far apart as Brazil, Iceland, Zambia, New Zealand, Korea and Singapore, and many other countries represented here. And of course, Edinburgh is the perfect setting for this global gathering. Its famous festivals are profoundly international, drawing artists and audiences from over 70 countries. They are cultural platforms and economic powerhouses, drivers of ambition and creators of cohesion. And they represent Scotland at its most confident, at its most open and at its most creative. So Edinburgh is the perfect setting, and 2014 is the perfect timing to host the International Culture Summit. This is an exciting and momentous year for Scotland. It is not only the International Culture Summit that is taking place for the second time. In 2014, we are welcoming friends of Scotland from across the world in our second year of homecoming. And a key part of this has been our very successful Commonwealth Games, which finished only a few days ago. Its associated cultural programme was Scotland's biggest ever cultural event. It showcased Scotland's culture on the world stage and culture from the 5 continents represented in the Commonwealth on Scotland's stage. And what was most important about the Commonwealth Games' cultural dimension, though, was not that it was big, but that it was challenging and that it was diverse. Challenging, for example, in the way during our opening ceremony, seen by 1 billion people worldwide, included a dance by 2 sole members of Scottish Ballet in a noisy stadium of thousands, but they commanded their audience. And the effect that even a brief exposure to the arts can have is illustrated by the artist who in that ceremony provided my favourite part of the evening, the South African soprano Phumisa Machikisa, and her first encounter with opera was when, as a teenager in a township, she fiddled with the dial of her radio and stumbled on a performance of The Marriage of Figaro. Her rendition of the song Freedom Come All Ye by the Scottish poet and folklorist Hamish Henderson was intensely moving. For a South African singer to sing this Scottish anthem to liberty, inspired by the South African struggle, was a fitting way in this year to mark the diversity of the Commonwealth. The song is an anti-imperialist song, and its first line refers to Harold Macmillan's speech in South Africa in 1960, hailing the wind of change that was liberating that continent. And in this year, when we commemorate the start of the First World War, the song's tune was an adaptation from the First World War pipe march, The Bloody Fields of Flanders. Towards the end of the lyrics of Freedom Come All Ye, Hamish Henderson hailed Nelson Mandela, who came from the province of Nyanga, as does the singer who sang that song, saying, "When a' the roses and geens will turn to bloom, and a black boy frae yon Nyanga dings the fell gallows o' the burgher's doom." So that one song connects us over time from a tune of the First World War, over place, from South Africa to Scotland, and over truths that must be told to politicians. As culture ministers, we concern ourselves with what the political process can do for culture, but we should never lose sight of what culture can do for politics. And for me, Hamish Henderson's words have long been an inspiration in my political life. So this is our second summit, following on the successes of that in 2012. It marks the point at which the Culture Summit is set in the international cultural calendar as a biennial event. And we have a lively programme of discussions and debates based on the summit's title, Culture, a Currency of Trust, reflecting culture's role as a universal medium of exchange that never loses its value for sharing ideas and building mutual understanding between nations, states and cities. So do enjoy this summit, enjoy Scotland, take full advantage of all that it has to offer. And let me finish with a few more lines from Hamish Henderson's lyrics, where he sets out a vision of freedom, where people across the world, and in Scots, bairns mean children, the bairns o' Adam can find sustenance and shelter as one community. So come all ye at hame with freedom, never heed what the hoodies crock for doom. In your house the bairns of Adam can find breed, barley bree and painted room. And I'm happy to provide a translation in our discussions later on. But a bit of Scotland, a bit of internationalism, a bit of culture, a bit of politics, a bit of understanding and a bit of sharing. That's what this summit is about. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. To welcome guests on behalf of the Government of the United Kingdom, it's a great pleasure to have the Right Honourable Sajid Jadid, MP, Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport and Minister for Equalities.
Good afternoon, Presiding Officer, fellow Culture Ministers, delegates and ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the United Kingdom Government, I would like to welcome you all to the second Edinburgh International Culture Summit. The summit is a unique gathering and it presents us all with a unique opportunity. An opportunity for figures from around the world to share ideas, insights and inspiration so that all creative sectors can flourish. Now, as we all know, the background to this summit is the Edinburgh International Festival and, of course, the Fringe and the Jazz Festival, the Blues Festival, the Book Festival, the Film Festival. Each summer, this city transforms into a living, breathing celebration of culture. But while Edinburgh is home to the world's biggest and best-known arts and culture event, it is by no means the only one in the UK. Today is the final day of Enniskillen's Happy Days Samuel Beckett Festival. The National Eisteddfod has just wrapped up in Wales, and we're right in the middle of the world's largest classical music festival, the BBC Proms. Such events have great intrinsic and social value, but they're also a powerful economic force. In Britain, our creative industries are worth over £70 billion a year to the economy, employing over 1.7 million people. And as with any major industry, government does have a role to play in ensuring its continued success. That's something we've worked very hard for in the UK. Despite the difficult financial landscape, the UK government is investing £3 billion of public money into the arts over 5 years. And hugely successful tax breaks for film and TV producers have now been extended to video games and to live theatre. But as we also know, that there's more to this than simply government money. We want to see a truly mixed economy, one in which the whole of society plays its part in supporting artistic endeavour. A few miles just from here, across the Firth of Forth, lies the birthplace of Andrew Carnegie, one of the first great cultural philanthropists. Today, artists around the world are in need of the 21st century Carnegies. So we offer great incentives to reward those who donate to the arts or bequeath private works to the nation. It all helps to create an environment in which our creative sector can flourish on the international stage, something that is increasingly important. You know, people often talk about the soft power of culture, but by sharing our art and our ideas with the wider world, we don't just gain influence, we gain understanding. We gain an insight into each other's lives, into what makes us different, and into what unites us. The Edinburgh Festivals aren't just about showing off British culture to the world, they're also about welcoming the world's cultures to Britain. And the same, of course, is true of this forum. We're here to listen to each other and to learn from each other. Just as the festival is an exchange of cultures, so this forum is an exchange of ideas, an opportunity to ensure the continued success of art and culture right across the world. That's a great responsibility, but it's also a great privilege. So enjoy the conference, and together, let's make the most of the unique opportunities it brings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary of State. If we're talking about all the festivals that are happening in Edinburgh at this time, I think it would be probably worthwhile if I was to give a plug for the Scottish Parliament's Festival of Politics, which starts on Friday next week. It is the first Festival of Politics run anywhere in the world. It's now in its 10th year. I know that many people are copying it. I think the original is the best. But if you're hanging about in Edinburgh and you'd like to take part in the Festival of Politics, we'd be delighted to have you. Plug over. We are here, of course, to talk about art and culture, ladies and gentlemen. So allow us to formally open the summit with some music. I would like to introduce Jordi Savall and Hesperian, 21 musicians, international early pioneers who will perform works from the cosmopolitan traditions of peaceful coexistence inspired by the Caliphate of Cordoba. This performance is entitled Homage to Coexistence. Jordi Savall and Hesperian 21, please join us.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We will start this small concert with this dialogue of souls, dialogue of Sephardic, Christian and Ottoman music, played by Nedjalkov Kaval from Bulgaria, Yurdal Tokam Ud from Turkey, Hakan Güngör Kanun, also from Turkey, Dimitri Psonis Santur from Greece, Mark Klos percussion from Spain, and myself from Spain and also from Catalonia. El Rey Nimrod from a Sephardic tradition. Now we play La Quarta Estampille Royale from the manuscript du Roi, Paris, end of 13th century. the Makam Husseini Sakil from the collection from the Moldavian Prince Dimitri Cantemir, Istanbul, 1680.
Thank you, Jordi Savall and Esperian 21 for an absolutely wonderful performance. We will hear more about the performance in a few moments, after Jordi Savall has made his way down into the chamber. But first, let us hear from Festival Director and Chief Executive Officer of Edinburgh International Festival, Sir Jonathan Mills, who will give an introduction to the Summit 2014 programme. Sir Jonathan.
Presiding Officer, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, may I add my warm welcome to those of you, Presiding Officer, and the Secretary of State and the Cabinet Secretary. The title of the 2014 Edinburgh International Cultural Summit, Culture, a Currency of Trust, reflects a belief in the capacity of the arts to build bridges of understanding between nations, states and cities, and to create a climate of trust and goodwill. Those moments throughout history when human society has been at its most innovative, inventive, and its most prosperous have been defined by its culture, by the arts and sciences in close proximity and collaboration, as witnessed, for example, in that period known as La Convivencia, coexistence, that existed during the height of the Caliphate of Cordoba in 10th and 11th century Spain, in which Islam, Judaism and Christianity cooperated so harmoniously, and to which Jordi Savall and his musicians of Hesperian 21 have just paid such an eloquent homage. The theme of the Summit 2014 is somewhat provocative. At a time when economic systems have become forces unto themselves and struggle to be perceived either as transparent or trustworthy, the thought that the creative outpourings of our civilizations, visual arts, sculpture, cinema, music, dance, and literature, might fill such a vacuum and become a mechanism for encouraging confidence and goodwill, a true and genuine currency of trust, seems appropriate, if a little confronting. Culture is a prism through which to perceive the equilibrium of any society. The stories we choose to tell about ourselves reflect our ambitions and values and have an inestimable impact on the cohesiveness and vibrancy of the world we seek to create. The Edinburgh International Culture Summit is hosted by a city in which for almost 70 years cultural relationships of a most diverse and intense kind have been initiated and nurtured. The summit is part of an endeavour to draw together the strands of these and similar activities in a world that is increasingly complex and multi-layered, and to emphasise the important role that cultural exchange can play in such times. The decision to hold the summit in August during the Edinburgh International Festival, indeed all of Edinburgh's summer festivals, extends to you all the opportunity to engage directly with one of the most diverse and vibrant cultural celebrations in the world. As much as it is a Scottish initiative, it offers a genuine international perspective, and I encourage you to embrace it as your festival, not just ours. Your presence is an encouragement to the 25,000 artists from over 70 countries who gather in this city in August every year. Equally, as a forum in which practitioners and politicians can come together, the summit provides you with a platform to discuss and promote, test and try substantial global issues of mutual interest to a highly ambitious alliance of artists and cultural professionals. In devising a programme for the summit, I am keen to cultivate a balance of voices, representing multiple perspectives rather than singular attitudes, recommending that no continent or particular perspective should dominate these proceedings. The summit asks you to compare the different ways in which we define and solve problems in a range of contexts and communities, to share your knowledge and to learn from each other's practical experiences. The summit is in two parts. A series of short presentations here in the debating chamber of the Scottish Parliament, which are in themselves an impetus for longer discussions and debates in which you will participate in private session. We have come together to consider three interlinked and far-ranging topics under the titles Values and Measurements, Advocacy and Identity, and Cities and Culture. I hope we will explore various ways in which we choose to define, measure and value the place of culture in our lives, to be aware of the divergent geographic approaches to this complex process, to acknowledge the many governments which are signatories to important international conventions for the promotion and protection of culture and the diversity of its forms and expressions, to examine the role of culture in international relations and national identities, and to discover the specific role that cities and city governments can contribute to enhance opportunities for individual and collective creativity. I hope that what will emerge from this summit will be a series of practical recommendations that are sensitive, sensible, and above all, applicable and achievable. Since going to print, there have been a few last-minute changes to the programme you have before you. Due to urgent and sad and unforeseen circumstances, Irina Bokova is unable to be with us. Daniel Cliche, Secretary of the UNESCO Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions, will present the speech that Madame Bokova had prepared and read it on her behalf. I'm also very grateful to Shona McCarthy, the Chief Executive of the Culture Company, who provided such inspired leadership to the City of Londonderry as part of the UK's inaugural City of Culture programme in 2013. She replaces Bridget McConnell as the rapporteur for our Cities and Culture discussions. I would like to acknowledge the support of the Summit 2014 programme partners, the Aga Khan Foundation, AsiaLink, the United Cities and Local Governments Agenda 21 for Culture, UNESCO, and the MIT Media Laboratory. I wish you well in the deliberations at the summit, and I hope that your time in Edinburgh is inspiring and rewarding. Thank you and enjoy these days that we have together.
Thank you, Jonathan. As Jonathan said, we're going to hear a series of presentations that will serve as provocations for the private policy discussions and the more informal dialogue that we encourage you to have with each other throughout the summit. But first, it's my pleasure to invite Jordi Savall to talk to us about Homage de Convivencia. Through his musical endeavours, Jordi has been appointed European Union Ambassador for Intercultural Dialogue and is a UNESCO Artist for Peace. Jordi Savall.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. It's for me a great privilege and an honor to be here, especially by this building, beautiful building, conceived and constructed by a Catalan architect, Miralles. It's also for me a pleasure to start this summit with music from a time which the music was a common language between Occident and Orient. In these early times, we use all the same monodic melodies, the same modes, the same improvisation on rhythmical, and we start to be different in Occident when we invented counterpoint and harmonies. That means from the end of the 14th century, our music has changed in the country. In Orient, they have continued to use the same modes. For this, in this pieces that we have played, I have played some medieval music from France, together with Sephardic music and Ottoman music. Only a small thing about the music. The music, in many of these contexts, was not like today, a pleasure to go to a concert, aesthetic, or something for to really make a big event. Music was something people need to survive. When a Sephardic family was expelled from Spain and has to start a new life in Istanbul, probably the music has helped these people to conserve hope, to start a new life. And every night when they've been together and they have sing these old songs, they have recovered peace in their hearts and have the energy to continue. It was the same probably from Scottish people or Irish people when they emigrate to the States and they take in the night the fiddles and a good beer and makes music, and they start to have again pleasure to continue and fight for their life. I think this is the big difference from the music, from this type of music, popular music, with the art music. The first music is music to help people to survive. And I think it's one of the important things today. Why, with the culture, we cannot resolve the problems of our time? I think this is one of the most important things to think. Only if we are able, with the culture, with the arts, to resolve the problems, the culture of the art will be something alive. Otherwise, it will be a decoration. And I think this is one of the most important things that we have to think. Otherwise, we will not find the solutions. I will remember very nice words by Shakespeare. The man that has no music in himself, nor is not moved with concord or sweet sounds, is fit for treasons, stratagems, and spoils. The motions of his spirit are dull as the night, and affections dark as Erebus. Let not such man be trusted, mark the music. It is true that the sound of melodies and the rhythm of dances speak directly to us, since every human being carries music in his heart. Music does not tolerate lies. That is why it is the true language of the soul, and the only one that allows us to communicate freely and as equals with cultures and beliefs distant and different to ours. Similar to the love, music is also the unique spiritual language capable to bringing peace to our hearts. But in order to make this possible, we need to stop the terrible sounds of weapons and restore a sincere dialogue between people in any situation of conflict. Music moves us through her beauty and emotion, graceful, conveyed through the performer. Without emotion, there is no memory. Without memory, there is no justice. And without justice, there is no future for civilized mankind. Can we still hope, as Dostoevsky says, the beauty will save the world? I think we can, but only as long as we are capable to fighting against ignorance and fanaticism by educating children through art, culture, and understanding. As Emile Malouf says, if we are to restore some hope to our disoriented humanity, we must go beyond the mere dialogue of cultures and beliefs towards the dialogue of souls, enclosed behind impenetrable barriers. Our boat is not doomed to interminable reefs. It can still be safe. After all, hasn't that, since the dawn of the human adventure, been the overriding purpose of art? Thank you.
Jordi, thank you so much for that inspiring contribution. I would now like to invite the Secretary of the UNESCO Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions, Daniel Cliché, to speak on behalf of UNESCO.
Good afternoon. The Right Honourable Tricia Marwick, Presiding Officer of the Scottish Parliament. The Right Honourable Sajid Javid, Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport of the United Kingdom. The Right Honourable Fiona Hyslop, Cabinet Secretary for Culture and External Affairs of the Scottish Parliament. Sir Jonathan Mills, Edinburgh International Cultural Summit and Edinburgh Festival. Sir Martin Davidson, CEO, British Council. Sir Vernon Ellis, Chair of the British Council. Excellencies, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, and dear friends. It was with great regret that Mrs. Irina Bokova, Director General of the United Nations Education, Science, and Culture Organization, could not be with us today. It is my honor to bring her message to you. I'm going to read, so when I say I, it's not me personally, but I. We have all been just inspired by the homage to coexistence, and I thank Jordi Savall, UNESCO Artist for Peace, and all the musicians for the passion for peace they have shared. This piece was inspired by the traditions of Cordoba, the traditions of mutual respect and tolerance, of living together between peoples of different faiths and cultures. Cordoba was a city of libraries and literature, a city of translation, a city of architecture, a city of knowledge and scholarship, but most of all, it was a city of dialogue. The history of Cordoba sends a powerful message to all of us today at this great time of change. This change is raising fundamental questions about how to live together and achieve equality in a new age of diversity, about how to strengthen peace at a time of fragility, about how to craft new approaches to inclusive and sustainable development in an era of new limits. We meet here in Edinburgh, another great world city, to address these questions and to explore the power of culture and creativity in answering them. As we meet in the middle of one of the world's greatest festivals of all time, with some 25,000 artists, 40,000 performances, 800 shows held in 350 venues with 3 million tickets sold, UNESCO calls upon this community to strengthen our advocacy on the power of culture, the arts, and the creative industries, to influence opinion around the world, and together to shape a new post-2015 global development agenda. Nowhere else is it better than in Edinburgh, where we can understand that culture is much more than monuments and books, and should not be mistaken as mere entertainment for the elite. Culture means jobs. Culture means inclusion. Culture means innovation. This is the message of this summit, and I wish to thank the Edinburgh Festival, as well as the United Kingdom Government, the Scottish Parliament, along with the British Council for this initiative. I really wish to thank you, and I ask you to do more, because people and political leaders need to listen. They need to understand the true power of culture, and I'm afraid we are not there yet. In too many high-level discussions, in too many ministerial summits and roundtables, people are still unaware of the importance of culture and hardly know anything about the true weight of culture and the creative industries, about the legal instruments at our disposal to foster creativity, how it works, and what it means. Of course, they all come to places like this to enjoy the music and the arts, but soon after they forget about it, as if it was the only parenthesis in the course of a more serious thought. UNESCO is determined to change this, and we have reinforced our advocacy like never before in the run-up to the post-2015 Global Development Agenda. But we cannot do it alone. So the Edinburgh Festival and this summit need to be a permanent endeavor, even beyond this event. And I would ask each and every one of you here today to bring the message of culture back to your homes, to your countries, to your friends, your families, to convince your political leaders, bankers, ministers of trade, finance, of the budget, of the crucial importance of culture to connect it with economic and social issues. This is the spirit and the deep understanding partnership Edinburgh and UNESCO have built together. The old medieval town and the neoclassical new town were inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 1995 for the universal value and significance. In 2004, Edinburgh became the first UNESCO City of Literature when we created the Global Cities Network. Edinburgh has made a bold choice to place culture at the heart of a sustainable urban development approach, as a tool to bridge the past and the future, as a strategy to better integrate the economic and the social dimensions of sustainability. At a time when half of the world's population lives in cities, this experience is extremely relevant. It reminds everyone at a global and a local level that culture is a source of identity and confidence at a time of change. It is a force of creativity and innovation in an age of limits. Culture is a driver and an enabler of inclusive growth. It is a channel to forge new forms of global solidarity and cultural citizenship. As the title of this summit says, culture, especially cultural diversity, is the ultimate currency of trust. It is a channel through which to craft creative solutions to problems, to address the existential challenges facing our societies, to sharpen our critical thinking, to challenge old models. Societies across the world are undergoing deep transformation and seeking to develop new sources of dynamism and growth that have local roots that are inclusive and sustainable. All are seeking to build new bridges of dialogue and social inclusion in societies that are even more diverse, and that's why culture matters. Culture matters for social cohesion and resilience. It matters for economic development and sustainability. It matters for dialogue and for understanding. This is UNESCO's message, and we are taking it forward across the world. These convictions also lie at the heart of UNESCO's culture conventions. They underpin our work to support governments and local communities, to design policies to protect cultural heritage, to support cultural sectors and creative industries, and to make the most of cultural diversity. Governments across the world are working to nurture the power of culture. And let me provide you some of the examples we've experienced. In Argentina, the Cultural Equality Project is working to better integrate communication and cultural policies to unleash the creative potential of creative diversity, dialogue, and knowledge sharing. In Brazil, they've created more than 3,000 centers for the arts across the country to promote social inclusion, urban revitalization, and job creation. China has made culture one of the pillars of its development strategy, and creative industries are considered at the highest political level as a key to the next chapter in China's rise. South Africa is committed to placing culture at the heart of national efforts to heal the wounds of the past, to strengthen social cohesion and sustainable growth. Korea's investment in creative industries stands as a leading example of the potential of the creative sector to foster innovation, research, and forward thinking. The President of the Republic of South Korea has talked about a new consensus, placing creativity at the heart of a new development model. All over the world, a shift is occurring, and we need to bring forward more evidence, more statistics about the power of culture. We need the right policies, the right capacities to sustain and shape it. The UNESCO Culture for Development Indicator Suite aims to provide evidence on the relationship between culture and development processes, and is currently doing so in 13 countries. We also have other evidence at hand. In 2011, the world trade of creative goods and services totaled $624 billion, more than doubling between 2002 and 2011. Developing countries show an even stronger growth in exports of creative goods, averaging 12.1% annually in this same period. Local cultural and creative industries such as the audiovisual sector, new media, performing arts, publishing, and visual arts generate a broad range of employment opportunities for artists and cultural professionals. For example, in Morocco, employment in the publishing and printing sector represents 1.8% of the labor force, with a turnover of more than $370 million. In Bangkok, there are over 20,000 businesses in the fashion industry alone. But there's more to culture than economic value. We must recognize the non-monetary contribution of the cultural and creative industries to the overall well-being of communities, individual self-esteem, and quality of life. Think of Medellin in Colombia and the remarkable culture-led regeneration that city has made. In Ouagadougou, in Burkina Faso, investments in a poor neighborhood outside the city center that built a music production facility with recording possibilities, training opportunities, and concert space situated in a new green space, not only generated revenue for artists, but access for the local population to come together around local cultural expressions at a price they can afford. The UNESCO Convention on the Protection and the Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions recognizes for the first time at the international level the distinctive nature of cultural activities, goods, and services, which have both an economic and cultural nature, because they convey identities, values, and meanings in addition to their commercial value. This is a fundamental aspect at a time when societies are looking for ways to recognize both economic and social dimensions of development. Indeed, people tend to work in silos, experts in the economy on the one hand, social analysts on the other. And we can also testify that ministers of culture are not always invited at the same table as ministers of finance at the economy. And we need to change this, because culture is precisely one key aspect to foster collaboration and the way to bring people together outside of their comfort zones. Culture is the answer, but it is also true that if we have cleared the ground from a theoretical perspective, we need to improve our tools and capacity to deliver on it. What do we need to make the 2005 Convention more effective and integrate culture into the post-2015 Sustainable Development Agenda? Do we need more and different targets? Do we need to change our approach to the mobilization of youth? What would all of this mean in terms of budget, in terms of funds mobilization? This forum is an opportunity to address these questions. In the 2013 Special Creative Economy Report published by UNESCO and the United Nations Development Programme, we explored the diversity of pathways to development through culture and the creative industries and how they can be strengthened. Governments have a tremendous part to play in framing legislation, in supporting infrastructure, and crafting effective policies. But the creative economy requires even more participatory and inclusive approaches, drawing on the experience and the ideas of civil society, local entrepreneurs, women, and youth. It means creating a flourishing, wider context across societies through effective education, through freedom of expression. I'm therefore encouraged to see today leading artists and intellectuals engaging with public authorities in such an open and wide-ranging debate. You are agents of change, and you are ambassadors for culture and development. I call upon you to advocate for more forward-thinking, human development approaches that recognize and utilize transformative power of culture and creative activity. This is the challenge ahead of us. Ladies and gentlemen, in today's global knowledge-based societies, creative assets are generating new forms of revenue and employment. The main challenge is to release diverse sources of inspiration and innovation, but we know it's not easy. Conditions for artistic and cultural expression vary considerably, both within and between countries. In many developing countries, the majority of people have no possibility of seeing a film or a play, visiting a museum, a library, a cultural center, either because the necessary cultural infrastructure is lacking or inadequate, or because they cannot afford it. Creative voices from the global south are gaining ground, but remain marginalized. Freedom of artistic expression, particularly for women, is limited in many countries. Our mission is to make sure that all voices are heard. We work together to develop policies based on principles of equality and openness to other cultures of the world. The ratification by no less of 134 parties of the UNESCO Convention on the Diversity of Cultural Expressions bears witness to the efforts made around the world to strengthen opportunities for artistic and cultural expression and participation in cultural life. This is also translated by new legislation on the arts and culture, especially on the status of artists. We all know that artists and creators live unstable lives. Increasingly, artists demand better social and economic conditions and unhindered mobility. In countries that have ratified the convention, policies are now helping artists acquire economic and social rights enjoyed by other laborers, enabling them to access universal social welfare programs for which they are often excluded. Artists are not looking for special treatment, just equal treatment. Together, we can promote their status, their international mobility, and facilitate preferential treatment and access for their creative works around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, with all this energy here today, we can influence the global dialogue on culture and development. You can raise your voice, not only today, but all throughout the rest of this year until the end of 2015. We stand before a historic opportunity to finally recognize culture as a driver and enabler of sustainable development. It is now time to integrate and to acknowledge in policies and strategies what is well known and shared by every citizen in everyday life. The post-2015 development agenda needs to propose a vision which corresponds to the needs of people. Recognizing the economic and non-monetary benefits that culture and the creative economy generate to achieve people-centered, inclusive, and sustainable development is a first step. Today, national consultations on culture and development are taking place around the world. International coalitions are emerging and supporting such messages. Alliances are being formed between organizations and networks in the South and in the North. Together with 6 other global culture networks, the International Federation of Coalitions for Diversity and the United Cities and Local Governments Agenda 21 for Culture are driving a global campaign advocating for the inclusion of culture in the Sustainable Development Goals. A declaration was elaborated in the framework of this campaign and has now reached some 2,000 signatories, including more than 600 organizations covering 120 countries. Their slogan is clear and strong. The future we want includes culture. Culture helps us indeed to think about the long term and reach our goals beyond our immediate needs. It seems that our societies have become obsessed with measurements, accounts, and ratings, ready to slice and dice our human capacities, believing that it would help us to tackle our most pressured challenges. But it doesn't seem to work. And it is high time we build a wider perspective and develop our ability to really think about the future. Culture is precisely what we can do to develop this bigger perspective, building on the legacy of the past, our millennial heritage, to strengthen our approach to the present and to the future. As sustainable development calls for ownership, we need to adapt to each context, and this is where culture can help, to foster participation, to craft a more balanced and meaningful development model for the people and by the people. As sustainable development calls for a stronger integration of the economic, social, environmental aspects of development, we must invest massively on culture, because it is precisely at the crossroads of these aspects, both as a driver of economic growth and as a source of identity and collective strength, we are to focus. This integrative dimension of culture is a most powerful accelerator of inclusive and integrated development. As we live in an age of limits of resources of our planet, We must make far more use of this ultimate renewable energy, that of cultural diversity, as well a wellspring of collective innovation to meet the challenges of the knowledge society and economy. The ministers of culture who are present today know this more than anyone. Sometimes we still need to convince ministers of foreign affairs, of economy, prime ministers, and we will continue our work. Culture must figure clearly in the future development paradigms and pathways framed by these new sustainable development goals, and UNESCO will continue to pursue its international advocacy for this noble cause. Thank you.
Daniel, thank you so much. I hope that you will pass on to Irina Bokova our sincere good wishes and to thank her on our behalf for such a thought-provoking speech. And to you, thank you so much for delivering it. We're now going to hear from Simon Anholt, who is an independent policy advisor and professor of political science at the University of East Anglia. He will give us his thoughts on good culture, good country, putting a value on our gift to the world. Simon, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much indeed. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The future that we want includes culture. I would go a little bit further. I would say the future that we need is unobtainable without culture. And in the next 13 and a half minutes, I'll do my very best to explain why I believe that to be true. First, a little canter through the last 15 years of what I've been up to and what I've learned about the role of culture as a result of that work. Back in about 1989, I coined a horrible phrase, nation brand. It's a horrible phrase, and I wish I hadn't coined it, but I was making a very simple point. I was making the point that countries in the age of globalization have images, they have reputations, and those reputations are absolutely fundamental to their ability to prosper and, yes, to compete in the modern age. The last time I checked, there were 196 countries in the world. Most of us know very little about most of them. We know a tiny bit about a tiny number of them. In a complex situation like that, we tend to go on the basis of cliches and commonplaces and, frankly, out-of-date, ignorant stereotypes. And this was the reason why I claimed back in the 1980s, the 1990s, that it had become a part of the job of every responsible government to become, in certain senses, a brand manager as well as a policymaker, by which I meant that they needed to understand that the good name of their nation was a sacred trust that they inherited when they came into office, and that the good name of a nation is its license to trade, its license to behave effectively in the community of nations, and that any good government must understand that its job, when it takes office, is to receive that good name and to hand it down to its successors in office, at least in as good condition as it received it, if not better. Moving forward to 2005, I decided it was time to try to put some numbers on this, because I discovered, to my surprise, that nobody had ever measured the images of nations before. There were hundreds and hundreds of surveys that measured what people believed to be the reality, what countries managed to produce, and how they were governed, and how they were run, and how fast they were growing, but almost nothing that actually measured what ordinary people believed about those countries. So, persisting in my unhappy choice of words, I created something called the Nation Brands Index in 2005, which grew to become one of the largest social surveys ever conducted. It's collected 200 billion data points since 2005, year on year, polling a sample representing about 70% of the world's population on what those ordinary people around the world think about 50 different countries and also 50 cities. I discovered a few interesting things. First of all, I discovered that they don't. They don't think about them at all. Unfortunately, the human race is not naturally cosmopolitan. And on average, most of us only ever think about 3 countries. We think about our own country a little bit, not a lot. We tend to think about the United States of America because it's very prominent and it affects our lives in all kinds of ways. And we think about a third country which varies depending on who you ask. the place they want to go on holiday, the place where their daughter is studying, the place where they lost their wallet, and so forth. 3 countries. Now that leaves 193, if my maths hasn't failed me, which, for the majority of the world's population, to all intents and purposes, effectively do not exist. So when a country that's almost unheard of comes along and says we want to make ourselves famous, we want to be branded, one does approach that with a little skepticism. Which of those 3 are you going to take out? Are you going to become somehow more relevant to the world's population than their own country or to the United States of America? Well, the following 10 years or so, I spent a lot of time advising a large number of governments on how they could understand and measure the reputation of their country and how they could improve it. And I spent most of that time reassuring them that propaganda does not work. Spending a great deal of taxpayers' money on expensively telling everybody how wonderful you are is singularly ineffective. In fact, there isn't one single properly documented case study in the history of the world, you'll have to take my word on this, to prove that it is possible to change the image of any country in the minds of the international public through messages and marketing and branding and communications and logo and public relations by so much as 1 millimeter. Because the other thing that the survey taught me is that we never change our minds about other countries. When we do, it's over decades and generations. The images of countries are part of the culture in which we live. The French view of Britain is part of the French culture. The British view of France is part of the British culture. These are gigantic anthropological structures which don't change just because you see an advertisement one day telling you how wonderful a particular country is. So I like to think that over about 10 or 15 years, I've saved a lot of taxpayers a lot of money by discouraging governments from blowing money on propaganda campaigns. But what does work? Well, what does work is very clear indeed. And about 3 years ago, I took some time off and I analyzed the database of the Nation Brands Index. 200 billion data points. I burnt 2 or 3 computers looking at it. And I wanted to ask the simple question, why do people admire one country more than another? It has a lot to do with that country's culture, a great deal. It has a lot to do with that country's perceived power, whether soft or hard. But the funny thing of all is that the most significant driver of any country's overall image, and consequently its ability to trade profitably, is the perception of morality. The idea that that country contributes something to the world that we all live in. People like good countries. What do they mean by good? Well, I use the word good not in the moral sense. I don't mean good as the opposite to bad, because that's a conversation that never finishes. I mean in a very practical sense, good as in the common good, the greater good. People like good countries, good as the opposite of selfish. So, as soon as I discovered this rather surprising and quite reassuring fact, I thought it was probably time to build another survey. So I created a survey which was completed exactly a month ago, and it's called the Good Country Index. It does exactly what it says on the label. It tries to measure, not in perception, but in reality, exactly what every country on earth contributes to the greater good, to humanity and to the planet. Extraordinarily, nobody had ever measured this before. The thousands and thousands of surveys and indices out there all treat countries as if they were little islands, as if they were sitting on their own planet in their own solar system, not connected to the rest of humanity in any way at all. And we all know, in the age of globalization, that could not be more untrue. And yet the impacts of countries on the rest of the world are simply never measured in the round. So what I did was I took 35 large, robust data sets, mostly provided by the United Nations and large international agencies and NGOs, which were good measurements of what countries contribute in the area of culture, in the area of peace and security, in the area of good global governance, and so on and so forth, science and knowledge, and of course the environment. And I simply combined all of those data sets together, and it produced a ranking. The ranking, which I released at a TED talk in Berlin a month ago, proved to be rather controversial. There was nothing I could do to fix it, because once you've done the arithmetic and once you've collected the data, whatever comes out at the end you have to live with. And it turned out that the goodest country on earth, and I say goodest because it's not best, it's goodest, in other words, the country which per dollar of GDP in 2010, when most of the data was collected, donated more, did more good to the rest of humanity than any other country on the planet, was Ireland. And this caused a certain amount of unhappiness, particularly in Ireland, for some reason that I still haven't quite got to the bottom of. The United States of America came 21st, and it was possibly tactless of me to release the survey on Independence Day. But there again, an awful lot of Americans understood that this was per dollar of GDP, so the US would have ranked a little bit higher. So why am I telling you about this? Well, because I think that this is, to use a boring word, the paradigm that we all have to get used to today. There's a very simple equation at the heart of this. If countries want to do better, they have to do good. It's just the same as corporations. Remember corporate social responsibility? The sudden realization, the revolutionary realization that if companies want to continue to earn the loyalty of their customers, they have to demonstrate that they are good members of society, that they don't just make money out of you, that they contribute something to the world that you live in. The same is true of countries, and why wouldn't it be? It's the same consumers exercising the same moral and ethical choices. So I've got rather bored of hearing countries talking about how they can compete against each other, because I've discovered over the years that only a tiny number of them will ever succeed in competing against each other. And I'm getting rather bored of hearing governments saying, how can we be more competitive? How can we be more competitive? And behind them, the television is showing the planet burning and people starving and killing each other. And the global problems increasing and increasing and increasing because there isn't sufficient cooperation and collaboration to tackle them effectively. The more we compete against each other and the less we collaborate, the faster we race towards a very uncertain and very dangerous future. The point about national image and the contribution of the perception of morality to national image is a revolutionary one because it shows us that the most effective way of competing is to collaborate if we work together. So where does culture come in all of this? Culture is absolutely fundamental because culture is the only instrument, together with religion and education, that can help the populations of the world grow spiritually to the stage where they can comprehend the meaning of the world that they live in, where they can literally exercise the imaginative faculty of envisioning the whole planet and not just their own country. During the last month since I released this index, I've received an enormous number of emails from people who are clearly struggling with what this does for their sense of nationalism. I've seen a lot of malignant nationalism. And if you listen to the developmental psychologists, the way they explain it is very persuasive. What they say is this: when a child is born, that child only has loyalty to his or her immediate self, to his self, to herself. As he or she grows, they learn to transfer that loyalty and that trust to their own immediate family. And then gradually, as they grow and they acquire more trust, to their community, to their tribe. The most we've reached in the 21st century is learning how to transfer that loyalty to the nation state, a structure which is 300-400 years old. And so we are living way behind the times in that respect. Our loyalty, for the majority of us, is towards the nation state, and our tendency, therefore, is to mistrust and despise those who live in other nation states. I don't think the World Cup helps this very much. I think sport, I'm not kidding, is partly responsible for stimulating that sense of competition between countries. I think culture comes from a completely opposite place, where it's about collaboration. The British Council's excellent word, mutuality, which teaches us that the joy of culture is doing culture with people, not rolling up your culture into a pellet and firing it at people and saying, look, admire us, in a propagandistic way, because nobody likes that. But the joy of doing culture together brings people together. I hardly need to stress that in this particular gathering. So culture is required in order to create the future that we need, because an enormous number of people now have to be gently helped and educated to the next stage of human development where they can imagine the world. And they can imagine 7 billion people. And they can say, yes, of course, my own culture is important, my own nation is important, but the malignancy is taken out of that. Culture needs to deliver two things to the human race, and it needs to deliver them very urgently. The first one is benign nationalism, a healthy, trusting, happy joy in your own national culture, and with that a preparedness to mix, to combine, to jam with other cultures and to make new culture. And the second thing that culture needs to deliver, again, as I said before, along with religion and along with education, is cosmopolitanism, the understanding that there's more to life than just a nation, that we're all in this together. And as I think it was Franklin so memorably said, if we don't hang together, we will certainly hang separately. Thank you.
Simon, thank you so much for that absolutely fascinating and interesting talk. Can I now invite Saskia Sassen to present Making the Open City the Hard Way? Saskia is a Robert Estlund Professor of Sociology and co-chair of the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia University. She coined the term Global City, the title of her seminal work in 1991. Saskia.
Well, it is a pleasure and an honor to be here. I speak as a researcher and as an academic. So, you know, it's a bit of a hard analysis. Let me start by a basic premise. Cities are complex systems, but they're incomplete systems. And in that mix of complexity and incompleteness lies their historic capacity to keep reinventing themselves. Now, when we then bring in culture, we're partly, and the significance of culture to a city, we're partly capturing a very long historic process that constitutes the city. Yes, there is culture that we bring to the city, events, festivals, all kinds of things, and they matter enormously. But the city itself, the urban condition, is itself a cultural condition. And that is, in a way, that mixity of incompleteness and complexity also means that every city is a bit different. But one thing that cities share, and which marks a difference with national states, is that confronted with conflict, the national state can easily militarize that conflict. Cities can't. Now, we have had historically, this is a footnote, cities that were fortresses. They were in the business of making war. But I'm talking about what we now think of as city, where commerce and the civic are the way in which conflicts, ideally, get triaged. Now, when you think of old Baghdad, when you think of old Jerusalem, when we think of Cordoba centuries ago, these were cities that are, but let me just stick with Baghdad and Jerusalem. These were cities where enormous differences coexisted. They constituted those cities. Today, those cities are in deep trouble. Not necessarily because of what they did, but because of what national states did. So I do think that this is something that is continuously intervening. Now, two points. I think that if you take the question of immigration, which brings in this sort of larger geopolitical dimension, and let's just focus on Europe, since we are in Europe. Let me start with a little story. When Haussmann was rebuilding Paris, he brought some immigrants. They were German Catholics and Belgian Catholics. And the French Catholics, the workers, said, oh, no, those are bad people. They're the wrong Catholics. France, and I mention France because France has the strongest tradition in Europe of accepting the outsider. When France brought in Italian women and young men, children, to work in the salt works, they were killed, some of them, by French workers. Those were also Catholics. When we then look today, and we have this very easy answer to the question of conflict in cities, cultural distance, religious distance, let me propose that we're fooling ourselves. Sure, there are extreme forms of any religion that create cultural distance. Historically, we know from our cities that all these differences have managed to sort themselves out. But also then, when in Europe, when in the 1700s and the 1800s, the immigrants came to the cities, and the immigrant was basically your cousin, same phenotype, same religious group, always a problem. So there is a way in which the city is a sufficiently complex system that it doesn't simply stand there open. It's not just a space you walk into. And Europe, compared to the United States, for me, is a great example. Because in Europe, the city mattered. In a way, in the United States, to simplify it a bit, you know, if the immigrant came, you say, hey, you are okay, come in, but you're on your own. In Europe, not. In Europe, the foreigner, the outsider, had to be incorporated. And that took work. Every epoch in Europe had racisms, butchery of foreigners, etc. And yet, every epoch constituted us, I'm Dutch, by the way, by my origin, constituted us as a more mixed people. Today, most European countries, I like to say as a bit as a provocation, are Creole people. Creole belongs to the Caribbean, typically. But in a way, we're all mixed. But yet, hey, confronted with the new immigrants, we keep coming out with the same rhetoricizing of the outsider, because incorporating the outsider is a big deal. I would argue that on the cultural front, I completely share, I should say, everything that has been said. I just want to put on the table another variable that gets at how a city is constituted. Its strength, that is a strength, if you want, but it's also a barrier. It raises the ante. So all these mini histories that I've been alluding to here in very shorthand actually have constituted something that we call the urban. And the urban has, at its core, a cultural dimension. It materializes through commerce and the civic and whatever. But it is culture in a very deep sense. Now, it seems to me, coming back to Baghdad and to Jerusalem, that these great cities, these great past histories, the bazaar being the center of mixing, and look what they are now. So something very powerful and negative is afoot. And I would say that it becomes even more important to strengthen that constitutive element of the city, but not just by bringing, much as I enjoy festivals, but by recognizing that urban space is partly a cultural event, with embedded codes. When we are downtown in a massive traffic at rush hour, I mean, not traffic, but lots of people, and we accidentally step on each other's feet, rip off a button, we don't take it personally. There is a code. This is rush hour. If this happens in a neat suburb, it's an act of aggression. So the city actually is talking. I just wrote an article that sort of makes me think also of what I'm saying, and I named it with a question. Does the city have speech? And I mean speech, the thick category that comes from law. We, the citizens, have speech. And let me put on the table a thesis. The city has speech. And when we think of the cultural, and when we think of a larger negative geopolitical situation, we should enable ourselves, our institutions, our children often are much better than adults at this, to recognize that speech of the city, because the speech of the city really travels the vector of the civic and commerce. Let me conclude with two elements, two sort of new developments. One of them is that in the current economic era, and I'm thinking especially about the familiar West, but I'm also thinking of other parts of the world, including China, India, etc. One trend is the urbanizing of economies in a very peculiar way. Think of a plantation, which is not in a city. That plantation, chances are, is producing for a global market, not just for its neighbors, right there on the plantation, around the plantation. That means that in order to access its markets, the grower of that palm or soy or whatever has an increasingly important urban moment, which is the moment when you have the lawyering, the specialized financing, the this and the that. When you multiply that example by most of our economic sectors, including, I repeat, non-urban economic sectors, you realize that the city is a kind of microcosm where more and more of the other, the non-urban economies have a moment. And I think that also means bringing in a kind of urban economic culture to bear on these larger economic processes. The same thing, I would argue, is happening with geopolitics, with international relations. When the Premier of China comes and visits the United States, if the recent past is any history, precedent, he doesn't go to the United States. He goes to DC, to Washington, to Chicago. They like to go to Chicago, and New York gets very upset when that happens, or they go to New York, more or less. I exaggerate a bit, but only a bit. Secondly, with privatizing and deregulating of economies, more and more, which used to happen between governments, now happens in the marketplace. Specialized law firms rather than legislatures, et cetera, et cetera. So you have a real urbanizing, sort of a creeping urbanizing in international economic transactions, in international geopolitical transactions. It seems to me that when we speak about the importance of cities and the importance of culture, we have got to begin to bring in these kinds of rarely mentioned aspects of the city. Because in a way, what we're seeing through this urbanizing of geopolitics, urbanizing of economies, and urbanizing of certain other aspects, is that the city must find a way to somehow develop its strengths, develop what mark its cityness, rather than what national states do. And I go back, it's the civic and it's commerce. So I would sort of leave you with a last thought. When we speak about culture, include in that the fact that the urban is itself a cultural event to a very large extent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Saskia, for that challenging speech. Our last presentation this plenary will be from London School of Economics and Political Sciences Professor of Accounting, Michael Power. Michael will talk to us about evaluating the cultural sector in the audit society, the challenges and dilemmas for policies. You're very welcome.
Presiding Officer, ladies and gentlemen, it's a very big moment standing here for me. I was born in Arbroath. I went to school. My first school was Andrew Carnegie's Dunfermline. My father worked in Rosyth Dockyard, and I watched the Forth Road Bridge being built. And now I've come over here to this magnificent building. So it's a big moment. I also asked myself, what is an accountant doing at a cultural summit? Isn't that something of an oxymoron? Well, I'm here to provoke, like the other speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in an age where individuals, organizations, and including cultural organizations and their events like this one, and states themselves must increasingly give accounts of their performance. And indeed, if an alien was to land in the United Kingdom today, they would assume that the purpose of organizations was to give accounts of what they do, rather than to actually do those things. And these accounts of performance must be measurable, public, and auditable. And my purpose in the next 10 minutes is to warn you of some of the consequences of this audit society, of this performance measurement, which is being exported, as I speak, to many of the countries that are represented in this room. So we have to confront an ambiguity, two senses of cultural evaluation. The first one is to do with the evaluation of creative culture, which is very perilous to define, but involves the ongoing critical conversations and reactions of publics and experts, their seasoned judgment about the intrinsic quality and worth of cultural products. The second is that of the audit culture. Cultural activity has never taken place in an economic vacuum. There have always been patrons and suppliers of resource, but this dimension has evolved to emphasize the periodic production of extrinsic and measurable financial and non-financial values. The core currencies of this audit culture are cost effectiveness, value for money, and latterly impact. These are the accounts that your Treasury ministers will want to hear from you. And these are probably the accounts that you, as policymakers, want to give to them. And the key question is, what are the points of real contact and friction between these two cultures, the two cultures of evaluation, the artistic and the audit? This is a re-rendering of C.P. Snow's two cultures of the arts and sciences. Actually, it's the arts and sciences and the audit culture. So how do you, as individuals, navigate these points of contact and make decisions which mediate fiscal and cultural realities? The Audit Society is my label for the systematic tendency in some countries for increased performance accounting, together with an emphasis on the measurable, visible, and auditable character of that performance, without any obvious beneficial good in doing that. Now, in the private sector, we might imagine this giving of accounts is a straightforward business. But even here, in the heartland of capitalism, performance is not always straightforward. What counts, short-term or long-term? Many organizations face pressures to give accounts of their non-economic dimensions, as Simon has already suggested, their respect for human rights, environmental compliance, and so on. And these complexities multiply in the cultural industries and in public organizations, which often have plural and competing objectives. Here, some of my colleagues have observed how key actors in a field in the public sector gravitate to the measurable and auditable dimensions of performance. In my world, at the London School of Economics, student satisfaction questionnaires have become a key performance measurement instrument. And these questionnaires tend to crowd out discussions of longer-term effects of student development, of the civilizing process, which is harder to grasp and harder to measure. So, in this society, a mix of bureaucratic tendencies coupled to very powerful accounting technologies of performance measurement can create a very dangerous climate, ladies and gentlemen, one which feeds itself through the measurable and countable and creates a false kind of precision in the way we manage all manner of activities. Now, the issue is partly technical. Inputs, financial and non-financial, and a range of activities are much easier and much cheaper to measure and much less contentious than outcomes and impacts that we might care about, especially as those impacts diffuse over space and time in very uncontrollable ways. But the real issues of the Audit Society is not about improving modes of measurement of performance. It's not a technical issue. It's the crowding effect of this logic of performance measurement. Performance evaluation often gravitates to and focuses upon partial representations of complex performances. The part ends up representing the whole. When I checked in at Heathrow this morning, I went through the security control, and at the end of security, maybe you've seen them, there's a buzzer system to kind of, you press a buzzer to say how your experience was. Did you have a good experience in security or not so good? Well, imagine if we had that buzzer system for theatres, as you left theatres. It asks you if you enjoyed the experience. Just 2 buttons, yes or no. Well, such a device, as funny as it may seem, even if only used by a few people, would generate performance data which can travel beyond the theatre and acquire or take on the status of the facts of performance. So there's a dangerous seduction of such instruments, even the less silly ones, and the facts that they produce. All of this poses serious challenges to many of you in this room. Your position, I admit, is a very difficult one. You have on the one hand the demand of treasuries and the difficulties of long-term planning. But the short-term effects of the Audit Society and a focus on revenues and costs, web hits, social media impact over very short time spans, and in my world, I almost have to have the impact before I've actually done any research. The whole causality has been inverted. These things can be deeply corrosive in the long run. And I think you have a responsibility to face that issue, if you haven't already, head on in your own countries. The essential contestability of value in the cultural field creates considerable burdens for you. So how practically might it be possible to hold on to both elements of the two cultures of evaluation in culture itself and the audit culture, when one is highly contested and the other contains at best partial measures of performance? Well, the answer is not to abandon measurement where it is possible. And sometimes even crude measures can give us a window on a phenomenon that's important to us. And the answer is not to contest fiscal realities with your Treasury officials. From what I've heard already today, I think you'd lose. The answer is to generate a distinctive policy attitude to measurement and auditability. And for this, you need to see yourselves as risk takers who necessarily embrace the uncertainty associated with plural narratives of value in a performance universe. In essence, in the cultural field, also in the economic field, but that's another matter, in the cultural field and many others, we take bets on things which are hard to measure. At the London School of Economics, we take bets on the civilizing process of the education that we afford our students. And it's surely better to be honest about those bets than to pretend that decisions have firm and precise foundations in auditable measures of performance. And these bets must be seen, as I'm sure they are in many cases, in terms of a portfolio approach to the cultural field, where the unit of concern is the shape of the portfolio itself as much as its constituents. This portfolio view requires confidence. It's the confidence of the advertising executive, you've probably heard this before, who says, I know that half of what I spend on advertising is wasted. The problem is I don't know which half. The challenge in the cultural field goes even further than that. Specific decisions that you make need to somehow take account of all the significant value narratives in play, the economic, the social, and the intrinsic, but without being bewitched by the measurable dimensions. And the only realistic way to do this is to have something like what I call in my world, the accounting world, a balanced scorecard as a decision aid. Such a device is not a mechanical input into decision making. It's not a formula, but it helps to remind decision makers like yourselves of the multiple values at stake in evaluating cultural activities, including over the long term. I don't mean to be patronizing when I say that decision making is hard. It is, but deciding is inevitable, and there's no luxury, we know, of keeping everything in play or keeping everybody happy. But the widest possible reflection on what is at stake and having processes for that, both the measurable and the unmeasurable, is the strongest antidote to the Audit Society tendencies and its effects in the cultural field. So I want to conclude with some specific questions that you as policymakers should ask, and even to suggest that it's your responsibility to leave Edinburgh and go home and think about what the answers to these questions might be. Are you sure when you make decisions that you have in mind the full value universe when cultural activity is evaluated? What processes do you have to give weight to these different values, and how do you structure the inevitable conflict between values? Do you just ignore some things? How can you be sure in your own countries that easily auditable measures of performance are not given excess weight in decision making? And how can you educate cultural organizations in your society to give the best and most authentic account of themselves to enable such a balanced evaluation by taxpayers and any other donors and sponsors. So what, in effect, does your balanced scorecard for evaluating cultural activity look like? And as an accountant, I would say this: what information do you routinely request and receive that supports that process? Because information drives your perception of what is relevant. So I conclude, the Audit Society, it seduces us, it gives us images of control, it makes us look in control, it gives us multiple measures of performance, and it enables a certain kind of checking and verification. But it also delivers, particularly in the cultural field, a false kind of objectivity. And over time, a silent disaster will unfold, where we no longer know how to evaluate complex cultural activities. So we invest more and more in evaluation systems which make them look more simple than they are. Ladies and gentlemen, it's over to you. Please do enjoy Edinburgh, as I am. Thank you.
Michael, thank you very much. As somebody who also grew up in Fife and saw the first Forth Road Bridge being built, I hope you'll take the time after Edinburgh to go to Queensferry and see the new Forth Road Bridge being built. So can I ask all the delegates to thank the presenters, the speakers, the performers, for sharing their thoughts and ideas. And may I take this special opportunity to say thank you to Hesperian for their inspiring music in our opening session. Tomorrow we'll see you back here first thing in the morning for another plenary session where we will hear a further 4 presentations addressing the themes of Summit 2014 before having our first set of policy discussions. That ends the session for today, but can I ask our ministerial delegations to wait for their delegate aides to return to the chamber, after which all guests are invited to join me in the members' room for the pre-dinner reception. Thank you for your attention this afternoon. I'm sure you agree with me. The speeches were thought-provoking, they were challenging, and I look forward to seeing you a bit more informally in a few minutes. Thank you very much.